Good. Well, really nice to see you all, and good afternoon, and fantastic to be back here at an LAA rally for several years. I can't remember in a row, but for the first time, as somebody who can actually do something directly to make sure that we in this country go from being a country with an enormous amount of history about aviation, an enormous amount of enthusiasm for aviation today. But actually, what I want to do is make sure, and I'm sure all of you do, or you'll tell me, is that we can live in a country where we are the future of aviation as well, not just here, but globally. That is my ambition. That's what I want to see happen. And I mean, do you agree? Do you think it's a good idea? Yeah. I knew you would. I knew you would. So look, my view is this. So that's the first thing. That's what we want to do. My view is this. If we want this country to be at the top of the table, first class in aviation, then of course, we need to make sure that the, Rolls-Royces and Airbuses and aerospace and all of that end of things are thriving and surviving and producing amazing new technology. But you know what? The way to get there is to be really attentive and really understand what is happening at the grassroots of aviation. Because it is at the grassroots of aviation that people first get inspired to go into aviation in the first place. I mean, if I look around this room, what made you interested in aviation? The chances are it was something to do with a practical, personal experience with flight. You looked up to the sky, perhaps you saw an aircraft, a glider, a microlight, and you got yourself involved by rocking up at the local airfield. So what happens if those airfields aren't there? How are we going to get young people involved in a sector to inspire them to reach for the skies and eventually end up in a Rolls-Royce or Airbus or whatever, if we carry on in this country blithely ignoring the fact that we only have a certain number of airfields and those airfields are being consecutively closed year in, year out? We have about 123 left which are licensed. There are many others that are unlicensed, but nonetheless, many, many of them are under threat. So, on my very, very full inbox, which includes things like getting trains to run on time, reviewing HS2, of course, big aviation decisions, including the future of Southeast air capacity and runways. The other things which really concern me, keep me awake at night, are how we ensure that us lot in the future, our children, our grandchildren, can still look to the skies and be inspired by aviation. And that is why I think it's kind of just so exciting to be here today. As I walk round, I think it's not unfair or untrue to say, drag my team round from the Department for Transport, more excitedly at each stand, looking at some new widget or gadget that has been invented, somebody who's themselves created an aircraft or built an aircraft with their own hands. Why I think it's so important that government finally, after all of these years, recognizes that we have to position ourselves as being the government who not only say, as they've said for many years, they want to make general aviation, the UK, the best country in the world for general aviation, but actually act on it too. So today, I've got a couple of opening things to tell you about. First of all, we're massively expanding the team within the Department for Transport, which is the Department for Transport, and therefore the Department for Aviation, to ensure that we understand that basic backdrop that I just set out, that without general aviation, there will be no aviation in the future. So we're massively expanding that team. They are working on a whole series of programs looking at subjects that will be very familiar to you, like those airfields that I mentioned, but also things like airspace and the way in which it is continuously being restricted in many dangerous ways. And I take the Farnborough outcome recently as a simple example of that. But not only the airfields and the airspace, what about how we get youngsters into this sector, into this industry? What about how we inspire people to do this in the future? I was talking to somebody out there who is, he says, the only British manufacturer beginning to end of permit aircraft. I'm probably a title that several people will dispute, but nonetheless, what we do know is in Britain, compared with, say, the Czech Republic, we're just not doing enough of that kind of stuff. And you know the number one problem that he just described to me? The first thing he said, I can't get youngsters who are in a position to literally create and build these incredible machines. So unless we sort out the learning part of it, the skills part of it, what we call the STEM part of it, we will not have an aviation future. So there are just so many things to do. I'm going to be, through the department, we'll be announcing a whole series of, I think, very exciting initiatives. And I'll tell you the one thing they will not be. What they will not be is an announcement of another review, another report, another study, because we know what is required. They will be announcements of actual action to be taken, things which are practical and things that I hope will help to ensure that we can be the genesis at this level of aviation, you can be, of ensuring that Britain genuinely becomes not just the best country in the world for general aviation, but as the new Prime Minister described in his first 4 speeches, the country which develops the future of aviation, including things like electric flight, greening up and ensuring that aircrafts are less noisy, that they're more environmentally friendly. And I bet you this, that technology will come from here. It will come from the small scale before it is enlarged to jets and commercial airlines. And again, that is why I think this whole project is so incredibly important. So this is going to be a very exciting period. I hope it lasts. I have no guarantees. There are 1 or 2 other issues out there which have the propensity to cause a bit of crosswind, shall we say. Headwind, perhaps, is more appropriate. But I think we can do this. I think we can actually shift fundamentally the government's approach to this sector. And I want to see that done, and I want to see it done really very quickly indeed. There is a fantastic new aviation minister called Paul Maynard, who you will be meeting, if you haven't met him already, very soon. One of the things I did was brought the aviation minister, for several years has traditionally been in the House of Lords. No problem with that, but actually more of the action takes place in the House of Commons. So I brought your minister, the aviation minister, Paul Maynard, into the House of Commons, or the responsibility into the House of Commons, so we get even more action more quickly, and you'll be meeting Paul soon. So look, I promise not to say too much. I'd much rather take questions and find out what's on your mind. I'm very happy to do that. There's a microphone roving around here, but I sense in this room that there's a real vision and capacity to make sure we build the sector fit for what it should be in the 21st century and put Britain at the head of it. So if you're with me, let me know, and let's have some questions. Thank you very much.
I'm Graham Clark, a disappointed ex-civilian instructor with the Air Training Corps. I started the Air Training Corps at age 13. Can you put some rocket fuel, some real substance, some real air into the Air Training Corps?
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a great point. And you mentioned rocket fuel. I don't know about rocket fuel, but one thing which really frustrates the hell out of me is when you train a pilot, they have to use avgas at the moment, and avgas is taxed. When they go and fly commercially around the world, there's no tax on that fuel. So not only do you have the cost of aviation gas being taxed both with VAT and with duty, but in addition to that, the actual training to become a pilot, and I'm talking now commercial pilot, involves a spare £100,000, and then you're taxed VAT on top. Name me, if you can, one other profession where you're expected to pay VAT on your learning. It is actually a bit like food or children's clothes. Learning is usually completely exempt from VAT. And somehow, in this sector, in our sector, we are being taxed to learn. And that means that it's very difficult for Britain to fulfill our role as the country of aviation language, English, the worldwide language for pilots. It's very difficult for us to fulfill what we should be doing. Boeing, who do the authoritative view on this, say that 804,000 pilots commercially will be needed in the next 20 years. And I can report that last year the UK trained about 860 of them. So we are nowhere on this. We're nowhere on it because of the costs of fuel, because of the VAT on training, and of course because if you keep closing down your training facilities by closing down airfields, you're unable to train pilots anymore. I mean, it's all pretty obvious stuff, isn't it? So we need to have all of this rebalanced. I'm not the Chancellor. I can't promise you that we're going to scrap all these taxes. I actually think there are other ways to get there as well, including encouraging things like electric flight, which then wouldn't have the same taxation elements in them and would be very good in the training aircraft. And that technology is already becoming available. And I want to see Britain lead the way on that. But I am also working across government to make sure that, for example, the money that is taxed out of this sector, about £10 million a year, the sector is about £4 billion, General Aviation, about £4 billion, about 40,000 people are employed in it. And actually £10 billion has been taxed out of it each year through the fuel duty, etc. And that money is never reinvested in the area. If you look at our roads and you look at our rail, then you'll see that the government is much more involved in hypothecating those taxes. And we want to see government recognise the value of what's been an entirely private enterprise, which includes things like training up pilots, and make sure that it is doing its part. So I'll be saying more about that in the future. But that's I'm trying to describe what I think the problems are, why we don't have enough youngsters doing what you did at 13 and joining the Air Training Corps, and we need to get back to that. Thank you. Who's got the next question?
First of all, Grant, thanks for coming and talking to us today. I think that's something we've not had before at the LAA. Question for you. I'm operations manager for Bristol and Wessex Airplane Club at Bristol Airport, and we used to use Cologne on a regular basis to do our training and do circuit work. Cologne was going to be closed, and it's now been given a reprieve until 2025. But as an RAF or ex-RAF station or airfield, it's still not usable because it's got no air traffic control and no fire cover. What can be done in the short term to actually open up these airfields for use?
Well, you may have done something useful in the short term, because I've got officials in this room who are looking at these issues of these airfields, which could be being used to train people, as our friend over here said, right now, to train youngsters, to inspire a new generation, to get pilots, air traffic controllers, massive shortage of them, those as well, into work. And I know that Cologne will be one of the, I know it is one of the airfields on their list that they are working through. So you have probably just done a very good service by mentioning it here, whilst I've got officials from the Department for Transport and now the Department for Aviation in this room and hearing what you're saying. We are working through all of these issues, of which there are many. And look, I mean, I used to be housing minister, so I totally get we need to build homes, which often is what happens to these airfields. But the crazy thing is, we could be both building homes and maintaining our ability to train people in aviation. So a great example of this, my constituency covers Panshanger. It was closed in 2014. Now exactly 5 years ago, not a single house has been built on it since. So none of that's happened, and none of the youngsters who would have been trained in aviation have been trained either. So it's a really bad outcome. And as I said to them all along, but we didn't really have the government policy in place back then, if you make that a mixed-use development where you build some homes and you do the aviation thing. I saw a very good example of this down at Lee on Solent the other week, actually. I don't know if anyone knows the airfield. They're building homes. They've got space. They're building homes. They're enhancing the airfield facilities, and it's a great community, it looks to me, building up there. I think this is the way forward. But anyway, you've raised it, and I think I see a nod that it's just been clocked.
And that's exactly what Old Sarum want to do.
Old Sarum, yeah.
On the airfield, but the council aren't letting them do it.
So the point here about Old Sarum was the council aren't letting that mixed development go ahead. You'll be pleased to hear that one of the things we've already arranged is that we'll be issuing new guidance to the councils to explain to them why, protecting a strategic airfield network is very, very important in this country, and that since there are so few airfields, very many of them will be indeed strategic to the country's future. And secondly, to guide them towards this idea of mixed-use development. We can have more houses faster, and we can have more young people coming in and being trained. Why would you not want to do that? It's just that it hasn't been joined up in the past.
Grant, I think that's absolutely amazing. It's incredible to have somebody an actual aviator in the Department of Transport who's fighting for us. So thank you very, very much for that.
Thank you.
And we look forward to seeing you again and seeing some of the results.
Thank you very much.